introduce Dr. Katie Schuman. She's a research scientist at Oak Ridge National Labs, and she has received her PhD in computer science from the University of Tennessee. And her dissertation was on using evolutionary algorithms to train spiking neural networks, and particularly for neuromorphic systems. And she's continuing her study of models and algorithms for neuromorphic computing at Oak Ridge National Lab. And she's one of the key figures in this field today. So Katie has a strong passion for education as well. So she's an adjunct faculty appointment with Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at University of Tennessee. And she's co-leading a research lab called 10 Neuromorphic Research Group. And she has about 45 publications and one of the most cited literature review paper in neuromorphic computing. So Katie has recently received the US Department of Energy Early Career Award in 2019. So it's my pleasure to have her here with us today and share some of the exciting things she's doing in neuromorphic computing. Let's give her a warm welcome. I know we can't clap, but
well,
Katie,
thank you. Thanks, Teresha. It's exciting to get to talk to you all today. I will turn off my video now for bandwidth reasons. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about neuromorphic computing, where hardware meets AI. You just got a little overview of my bio, but just a little bit more background because it sort of informs the way I approach neuromorphic computing. So I am very firmly a computer scientist. Many people in neuromorphic are electrical engineers, computer engineers, material scientists, etc. But I'm a computer scientist, so I'm approaching neuromorphic computing from the computer science perspective. So I've been studying algorithms and spiking neural networks for neuromorphic systems since my graduate research work. I joined Oak Ridge in 2015 as a Leanne Russell Early Career Fellow. I mentioned that specifically because if you are a graduate student and you're looking at opportunities for postdoctoral positions, the fellowship programs at National Labs are a great opportunity to get to continue your research efforts. So I was able to bring neuromorphic computing into Oak Ridge with project programming and usability of neuromorphic computing, really focused on the algorithms and the applications and the software side of neuromorphic systems. Teresha mentioned the survey paper. I'll mention that later as well if you're interested in learning more about neuromorphic. The goal with that paper was to give an overview of the field. And I will tell you, if you download that paper from arXiv, it has 80 some odd pages. Don't worry about that. It's really only 22 pages. Most of it is citations. I cite over 2,500 papers. I spent a lot of time reading a lot of work in neuromorphic for that paper. So I hope that it would be useful to you to learn about the field. And a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about in today's presentation is in collaboration with the research group at the University of Tennessee, the 10 Lab Neuromorphic group, which is the picture you see on the slide here. So as a computer scientist, a question that I was asking myself as an undergraduate, and I still frequently asked this, which is, why should I care about hardware? Why should I care about custom hardware for different applications? Can't I just continue to use the sort of hardware that I'm used to? And so several years ago, a series of headlines started to emerge. Moore's Law is dead, now what? From the Wall Street Journal, if the end of Moore's Law is near, what's next? From the New York Times, Moore's Law running out of room, tech looks for a successor. And then this is my favorite one. Moore's Law really is dead this time. So my favorite joke about the looming end of Moore's Law is that the number of people who say that Moore's Law has ended doubles every 2 years. So there's some disagreement in the computing community as to whether or not Moore's Law has actually ended, if it will end. But there have been consequences to the computing community in the performance of existing systems today that are influencing us to explore alternative and complementary architectures to the traditional computer architecture. So the looming end of Moore's Law and certainly the end of Dennard scaling is one piece of the puzzle. But there are other factors as well that are leading us to consider different types of computers. A second factor, which I'm probably preaching to the choir here, is the explosion of the use of AI and machine learning. So the way that we're using computers is changing not just, the types of computers. So our workloads, the actual applications that we're running, we're doing a lot more AI and machine learning now than we were a decade ago. So if we're thinking about new types of computers, it would make sense to think about tailoring a new type of computer specifically for AI and machine learning applications. But that's not the only piece of the puzzle either. We also have this growth in the Internet of Things, the explosion of smart sensors, where we're pushing compute everywhere from our phone to our watch to our microwave to our refrigerator. And in a lot of these cases, we want to be able to do very efficient computation, very small systems. And many times we're also interested in doing AI and machine learning at the edge as well. And so again, if we're thinking about building new types of computers, maybe we want an AI machine learning capability, but we also want the ability to do it in a very efficient way. So all of these things kind of combined together leads us to taking inspiration from biological neural systems, taking inspiration from the brain in building new types of hardware because it kind of fits all of these different aspects. And so with that, I like to categorize the kind of brain-inspired hardware community into two separate categories. And I want to emphasize that I focus primarily on the neuromorphic computing side and not on the neural hardware side. So specifically, I want to distinguish between those two here. So neural hardware systems are custom hardware that accelerates traditional neural network and deep learning computation. And an example would be the Google TPU. So these are systems that are very well suited to existing algorithms. In fact, they're built to accelerate today's deep learning computation. They have very efficient matrix vector multiplications, things like that, to be able to accelerate today's algorithms. Many of these systems have different implementations that are targeted either towards very fast computation or very low power computation. So for example, the Google TPU, they have a cloud version, which you see on the slide here, but they also have a Google Edge TPU, which would be more suited to edge deployments. And these are systems that are currently deployed in the cloud, in mobile devices. They're things you can buy on Amazon today. So these exist, they're really cool. They're out there in the world today, accelerating today's computation. I dabble a little bit in exploring different neural hardware implementations, but the majority of my work is focused on neuromorphic computing, which is very, very different from the neural hardware accelerators. So my definition of neuromorphic computing are systems that are implementing spiking recurrent neural network computation, taking a little bit more inspiration from biological neural systems, so much so that they can actually be suitable for performing neuroscience simulations. Now, with these systems, there is significant promise for future algorithmic development. You can map some of today's algorithms onto these systems, but they also offer additional capabilities, and they have really great promise for the future in figuring out how to utilize these to do more kind of brain-inspired learning. These systems can give you fast computation and low power. They're event-driven in the way that they operate, which gives you this kind of low-power operation. But these systems are still in development. So there exist neuromorphic computers like Intel's Loihi or IBM's True North, but they're really systems that you can only access if you're part of the neuromorphic computing research community, if you're part of the Intel research community or IBM, and not something you can just go buy on Amazon quite yet. So they're still in development, but they're really exciting systems that do exist and have a lot of promise for the future. So my research focuses more on the neuromorphic computing side than on the neural hardware side, and so I'm going to be talking all about neuromorphic computing over the course of the next several minutes. So I like to give this kind of high-level view, cartoon-level view of contrasts between the von Neumann architecture and a neuromorphic architecture. So the von Neumann architecture, which you see on the left of the slide, you see the CPU separated from the memory unit, and then it shuttles instructions and data back and forth. These systems have sequential processing, they have separated memory and computation, they tend to be very power intensive. You program them, you write code, and then it runs those instructions, and then they are very high precision. For the neuromorphic systems, it looks very different. And so this is a system that's made up of many different neurons and synapses. The neurons are connected to each other via the synapses, and this is just a grid layout, but you might have lots of different connectivity patterns that would be realized in different neuromorphic systems. And the neuromorphic architecture is massively parallel. The neurons and the synapses are all operating in parallel in the system. It also has co-located memory and computation. Both the neurons and the synapses have a notion of memory and computation in the way that they operate. They tend to be very low power, as I mentioned before. They are event-driven systems. They only do work when there's work to be done, so they're very efficient. You tend to do training or learning with a neuromorphic architecture rather than programming them with instructions, and they tend to be relatively low precision. So this is kind of the high-level 10,000 foot view of these two different systems. but it gives you a couple of ideas of how they're different from today's computer architecture. So my question, again, I'm a computer scientist in this field, so my question with new hardware is always, how do I actually program it to make it do something interesting for me? How am I going to design a program to perform a particular task on this new type of computer? So in a traditional system, you write some code, and then it compiles it and it runs on that system. The equivalent of a program for a neuromorphic system, even though we're not explicitly necessarily programming them, there is still a notion of a program that is going to perform a particular task. In the case of neuromorphic, that program is a spiking neural network. So just to remind you, I'm sure I don't need to remind this crowd, but just in case, when we think about traditional artificial neural networks, the way that they do computation is they receive a set of numerical values, an incoming input vector, which is passing information through the network. You multiply by a weight matrix that represents the synaptic weights in that layer. So you do that matrix vector computation that's accelerated in those neural hardware systems. And you apply a nonlinear activation function, which gives you a new vector at that layer. And you repeat this sort of computation as you go through the network. Spiking neural networks look very different in the way that they do computation. And there's a couple of key differences that I want to emphasize and how they're different from traditional artificial neural network computation. The first is that synapses in spiking neural networks, or neurons in the spiking neural network, or sometimes both, have a time component in how they process information. So what that means is it takes time for information to propagate and travel throughout the network. And the timing of the arrivals of information at different points in the network affects how the network does computation. And so you don't just have those matrix vector computations anymore, you have these time components within the network. This is how it operates. You can also have very complex network structures. Many spiking neural networks on neuromorphic system architectures can have various levels of connectivity. Any two neurons can be connected by a synapse potentially in many of these systems. You can have things like cycles, you can have multi-edges, you can have loops in these networks, things that might not necessarily make sense in a traditional artificial neural network setting. And then you have temporal input and temporal output on these spiking neural networks. So rather than a single set of values arriving at a network simultaneously, in this case, the spiking neural networks receive in over time, and they produce spikes out over time. And the timing of those spikes coming in, the timing of the spikes going out influence the decision-making of the network. So I spent a huge amount of time at one point making the next set of slides. So we'll just walk through briefly some example of some computation on a spiking neural network. And so what you can see here are some spikes that are going to come in over time to the input neurons. And here I'm just going to walk through the first set of spikes arriving at the input layer, causing those input neurons to fire, creating more spikes that are traveling throughout the network. And you can see the spikes propagating throughout the network. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner, there's two synapses that connect two neurons. You can see because those synapses have different lengths, different time delays, the spikes going along them are different. And you can see then that the spiking neural network produces spikes as output. And so this is just a kind of cartoon level view of a small scale spiking neural network that hopefully, if you aren't familiar with spiking neural networks, you now have an idea of what the spiking neural network computation looks like. This is a very toy example of a spiking neural network. On the next slide, I'm going to show a video. Hopefully you'll be able to see that video and it won't be buffering too much. This is a real spiking neural network that we trained to perform a scientific data classification task. And so the yellow input neurons over on the left side of the network are receiving spikes from external to the network. They're receiving information about the data, causing spikes to propagate throughout the network. There are inhibitory and excitatory connections in the network. Those are the orange and the blue synapses. And then the red neurons are the output neurons. So those are where we would be monitoring the spikes that are coming out and looking to see what classification decision that this network is making. So hopefully you can see the animation here in the network. Hopefully it looks like the cool 80s video game that it does on my screen. And hopefully, again, this gives you a better idea of what the computation might look like. And this is, again, performing a real task on the spiking neural network. This is actually taking the data and then providing a classification label for that data. Okay, so you may be looking at this network and thinking, wow, that looks crazy. What could possibly have come up with a network that looks like that. It kind of looks like a hairball, all the synapses going everywhere, neurons all over the place. So this is a key question in the field of neuromorphic and spiking neural networks is how do you come up with the right neural network to solve your problem? And so that is the question that I have focused most of my research on is how do you come up with the right spiking neural network structure to solve a particular problem? And so how do you build it? How do you train it? How do you design it? So some of the questions that we have to answer when we're coming up with this spiking neural network is how many neurons do you need to solve the problem? How many synapses do you need? What should the delays on each of the synapses or the time component in the neurons, what should that be? What should the weights on each synapse be? So that's kind of the canonical question that we're asking about most neural networks. But it's just one piece of the puzzle for a spiking neural network. And then what should the threshold or activation value be for each neuron? So unlike traditional artificial neural networks where we kind of have this long history of people iterating on different neural network architectures, with deep learning, we kind of have the model zoo of example models that work well. We have hundreds of thousands of graduate students iterating on different neural structures and sharing those to tell us that building up kind of the community's intuition about what's going to perform well and what's not going to perform well. We don't really have that luxury in spiking neural networks, so we don't really even know how to start with a good structure, especially when we have these kind of non-traditional cycles, recurrent connections, et cetera. And then we have these additional questions like what should the delays be in the network that aren't necessarily answered by the traditional artificial neural network literature either. So it's already a really hard problem to come up with a spiking neural network that's going to solve a particular problem, to figure out what all of the answers to these questions should be. But when we're thinking about putting them onto particular neuromorphic hardware, it gets a little worse. Because different neuromorphic hardware implementations have very different neuron models, so how the neuron actually functions and how many parameters it might have can differ from neuromorphic implementation to implementation and often does differ. They can have different synapse models. They can have different levels of connectivity, so how you can actually connect the neurons to each other via synapses can be different from system to system. And then even if all of the other things are the same, if you have the same neuron model, if you have the same synapse model, if you have the same level of connectivity, available to you. If you're implementing your neuromorphic system with different devices and materials, it can radically change how the networks function on those systems. And a lot of the work in neuromorphic is using very innovative devices and materials to build these systems so that they can be as efficient as possible. But using different devices and materials can change the way that the network functions. So what this means for me as a computer scientist is that when I'm coming up with a spiking neural network to solve a problem, I don't just have to think about the problem, I also have to think about the hardware that I'm going to be deploying it to. So these systems aren't really portable. You can't take a network that runs on one neuromorphic hardware system and expect it to behave the same on another neuromorphic hardware system. So just to give you an idea of sort of the diversity of different neuromorphic hardware systems that are out there and what makes this hard, we've worked with lots of different neuromorphic hardware systems. These are just three kind of exemplary architectures. They're Dana 2, Mr. Dana, and SOAN. So Dana 2 and Mr. Dana are both systems that were developed at the University of Tennessee. They're part of the same family of architectures, the Dana family, but they're two very different systems. So Dana 2 is a fully digital system. It's a system that can be implemented using conventional CMOS, or it can even be implemented on an FPGA. Mr. Dana, on the other hand, uses the same neuron model, the same synapse model, the same kind of high-level characteristics as Dana 2, but it is a mixed analog digital implementation where the synapses are implemented with twin memristors. And memristors are a device type that has a memory in the way that they perform computation. The word memristor is memory resistor. And so the memristors are very natural to implement synapses, but having the synapse implemented with a memristor changes the functionality of the synapse from what it was in the Dana 2 system. So networks that we train and design for Dana 2 don't map directly into networks that were trained using Mr. Dana. And the third class, the third example, is SOANS, and this is a system that was developed at NIST in Boulder, Colorado. And this is an optoelectronic system where the neurons are implemented using superconducting optoelectronics. And again, this is a radically different system from the other two. It has radically different performance characteristics, how the neurons function, how the synapse function. And these are three systems that we've used all in the same day. We've trained networks for all three of these systems. within a very short time period. So it's not like we're focusing on one system or another. We're constantly trying to design networks for new and emerging neuromorphic hardware. So if we're trying to come up with approaches for designing spiking neural networks, we need to think about not only the problem we're trying to solve, but also think about the hardware that we're targeting, the architecture, the device, and the materials that are being used to develop those. So I see a question in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and answer that now. So it says, have you ever seen anything that would relate to intuition within the spiking neural networks community? I would think you would define a leap from initial sensory input to final level of neurons before final output. This would be a multidimensional spiking network. Can you provide any insight on this? I think we are working on developing intuition about what spiking neural networks might look like, but I think we're far from having kind of a sweeping community-wide intuition for what we're looking at. But definitely, I think there's the opportunity to have this kind of very complex spiking neural network structures. I think my intuition says that the recurrent connections are going to be very important. That seems to be confirmed by some of the neuroscientists that I've talked to. And so that's the sort of intuition that we're trying to build up now. I don't know if that fully addresses your question, but we can get back to it towards the end. Okay, so we're looking at these algorithms that can target not only the application that we're trying to solve, but also the hardware. And so our group looks at lots of different types of algorithms. We look at more kind of traditional backpropagation-based training. We also look at reservoir computing and liquid state machine approaches. We look at neuroscience-inspired plasticity mechanisms like spike time-independent plasticity. But our primary focus has been evolutionary and genetic algorithm-based approaches for training and designing spiking neural networks. So when I was in graduate school, I started developing this system, and we've continued iterating on it over the last 5, 6, 7 years now. And this system is called Evolutionary Optimization for Neuromorphic Systems, or EONS. And the way that EONS works is we start with a particular application in mind that we're trying to solve, and a particular neuromorphic hardware implementation on which we want to solve it. And EONS starts with a random population of potential network solutions. And so here I'm showing 4 potential network solutions. In reality, we usually have a population of at least 100 networks, sometimes up into the thousands to hundreds of thousands of initial network solutions. Typically, these are completely random. Sometimes we might have a little bit of intuition about what the networks might look like. We might inject that into the population to start with. But usually we don't know much of anything, so we just start with a random collection. And that forms our initial population. And then we take those networks and we evaluate and we rank them. And so as part of this evaluation process, we take each of the networks and we run them on the hardware or a simulation of the hardware on the application of interest. So we actually test to see how well they're going to perform on that hardware implementation and on that application. And we assign each of those networks a score for how well that they're performing. That's the fitness score. And that lets us rank the networks from best to worst. At the beginning, they're all kind of terrible, especially if they're randomly initialized, but some are slightly better than others, which allows us to define this ranking. And then from there on out, we perform a selection procedure. We use selection algorithms from the genetic algorithm literature to preferentially select better performing networks to serve as parents while still maintaining some notion of diversity in the population. And then we perform reproduction operations to produce children networks. And these reproduction operations include things like crossover recombination, where we take multiple parents and produce children that have components from each of the parents, and operations like mutation, which make small scale changes to the networks, like adding a neuron or synapse, deleting a neuron or synapse, or changing some of the parameters in the system. From this child population, we then go back and we evaluate and we rank them, and we repeat this process over and over again. And so each time we do that, that forms a generation in our genetic algorithm or evolutionary approach. And we repeat this for some number of generations or until some desired fitness value is reached. So if you know anything about genetic algorithms, you may know 2 things. One is that people often say that genetic algorithms are the second best solution to any problem. In this case, I would argue that we're still trying to figure out what the best way to design spiking neural networks for neuromorphic hardware is, and that genetic algorithms are a good stopgap in the interim. I think there is going to be a better solution that emerges eventually, but this has been a great approach for us in the meantime to come up with networks for different emerging hardware approaches. And then the second thing is that people will often say, aren't genetic algorithms slow to converge? there's a reason that the system is called EONS. That's a little bit of a joke, but in reality, this doesn't seem as bad as it might seem in your minds. In reality, we actually often can train networks within a few minutes or a few hours, depending on how complex the problem is, and get to a pretty good solution for a lot of the problems we've been looking at. So the convergence times have not been as big of an issue for us as they might be. But there are a lot of different reasons that we do use evolutionary optimization and why it was an approach that was attractive to our research group at Oak Ridge and at the University of Tennessee. And the first is that it's applicable to a wide variety of tasks. You can change the type of task that you're training for very easily, because all you need to be able to do is provide a fitness score for how well the networks are performing the task. So you can do classification, but you can also do control or prediction or anomaly detection. You just have to be able to have a score that can say this network is better than that network. This is also applicable out of the box to a wide variety of different architectures and devices. We've used it, I think we're up to over 10 different neuromorphic implementations and spiking neural network simulators, and it will train within the characteristics and constraints of the architecture or device that you provide it. So if your neuromorphic implementation happens to have quirks, let's say, and many of them do, EONS will attempt to leverage those quirks to its benefit to try to solve the problem, or it will try to operate within whatever constraints the system has. It can learn the topology and the parameters, so not just the synaptic weights of the network, so it doesn't require any prior knowledge from the user in deciding what the network should look like. It can interact with software simulations or directly with the hardware itself, so it can tailor it to a particular hardware implementation if you happen to have the hardware with you. And it's parallelizable or scalable on high-performance computing or supercomputing systems, which happens to be pretty important for me at Oak Ridge National Lab, because we happen to have access to the Summit supercomputer, which if I were in my office at Oak Ridge would be about 50 yards from me, but as I'm at home, it's a little bit further away. But it's still really nice to be able to take an algorithm like EONS and to be able to scale up the population size, run it on a system like Summit, and using systems like Summit or other clusters or high performance computers, you can get to better solutions much faster. Okay, so now that I've told you about how we design spiking neural networks for neuromorphic systems, I will very briefly go through some of the applications of neuromorphic systems. I'll tell you then specifically about the applications that we have focused on at Oak Ridge and at UT. So this chart came from a neuromorphic computing workshop we had at Oak Ridge National Lab in 2016, wherein we locked a group of neuromorphic computing experts. I believe Jerisha was one of those experts into the Oak Ridge National Lab Conference Center, and asked them to come up with a variety of things about neuromorphic systems, including what the characteristics are of applications that would perform well on neuromorphic hardware. And this was the list that group came up with. Applications that have a spatiotemporal component, noisy input, requiring real-time processing, requiring multimodal processing, low power, low precision, requiring robustness, and continuous learning. And so with these sets of characteristics, we can start to define some areas in which neuromorphic computing could be successful. And those areas include for scientific discovery, because the scientific experiments often produce spatiotemporal data with noisy input, require real-time processing, etc. As a coprocessor in a future high-performance computing system, like a future Summit, to do large-scale data analytics, to perform cybersecurity applications, to do control and autonomous vehicles and robotics, and to be deployed into Internet of Things and smart sensors. And so it's not necessarily true that the same neuromorphic system would be the system you would deploy into a smart sensor as you would put as a coprocessor in a high-performance computer, but they could actually look very similar because neuromorphic systems are inherently scalable. So it could be that you just have a small version of the neuromorphic system that's deployed in the smart sensor, and you have a much larger version of that that's deployed as a coprocessor. So there's a lot of really exciting applications across the field of neuromorphic, and we have a lot of opportunity to make an impact in fields such as these. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to start with one of our toy examples. So as Jerisha mentioned, I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Tennessee, where we have this 10-lab neuromorphic computing research group. We have lots of students, both graduate students and undergraduate students, who work with us in that group. And our undergraduate students often join the group to work on applications of neuromorphic systems. And so as a result, many of our applications are some version of video games. And so hopefully you can see the video here that I'm about to play. This application was a student application built a couple of years ago that is a version of the Atari game Asteroids. So in this version of Asteroids, rather than having the input to the network be the full image that the person, the player, would see, we instead changed Asteroids such that rather than having the neuromorphic system having the full view of the entire field, we said, what if the neuromorphic system was sitting on board the ship and it only had information from the ship's perspective about the environment? So changed it a little bit more into sort of an autonomous system control. And so what we did is we equipped the ship and Asteroids with a set of 30 LiDAR sensors in a circle around the outside of the ship. And so that is the input that the network can receive from the environment, is the LiDAR sensor information about where asteroids are in its field of view. And then the output information of the network is the controls of the ship: turning, thrusting, firing. You can see the network that EONS designed on the left side of the slide. You can see the LiDAR sensors in the circle around the outside, the outputs in the middle, the turning, the thrusting, and the firing. This network only has 10 hidden neurons, so EONS often designs very small networks and leverages lots of recurrent connectivity in these networks. And so let's go ahead and see how this does. So hopefully you can see the network controlling the ship. The network, the different neurons are flashing. Those are the spikes as they're occurring as it's actually simulating. And these are correlated views, so this is the activity in the network that's happening as it's controlling the ship and the environment. You can see the ship navigating throughout the environment, performing fairly well. This particular spiking neural network, we evolved lots of them for this task, and most of our tasks, we evolved many networks. This particular network was relatively aggressive in how it attacked ships and asteroids in the environment. It gets very close to the different asteroids, and in fact, will occasionally get so close that it will be hit by the shrapnel of the asteroids and end up being killed in that implementation. So actually, one of the things that we were able to do with the genetic algorithm approach, I had a student, actually a high school student last summer, who updated the fitness function to accommodate for different behaviors. So it's not just based on the score on the game, but also on other factors to make it more cautious or more aggressive in the environment. Okay, so I see I have another question as this is continuing to play. How does evolutionary optimization fare in terms of on-device learning or with respect to its feasibility on hardware? Do you utilize a mix of local learning rules and have evolutionary optimization as a meta learner? That's a great question. Yeah, so we do utilize local learning rules if they are available on the hardware, and in that case, the evolutionary optimization can operate as a meta learner. Otherwise, if you don't have local learning rules available, it will attempt to learn everything associated with the hardware. One of the things that I'm really interested in using EONS for is to learn learning rules as part of the design process, and that's something that I'm going to be looking at as part of my early career proposal. So you can see here at the very end of the clip on the asteroids example that it does get a little bit overly aggressive and run into the shrapnel of the asteroid there. So it's certainly not a perfect network, but it's a pretty fun example anyway. I will note that our students love these applications. They've been really good for us to understand the behavior of EONS. And I will also say that this work is sponsored by the Air Force Research Lab. And it turns out that the Air Force also really enjoys video games where ships shoot things. So it's been a really fun example for our group to play with. Okay, so here is a little bit more of a Department of Energy style application. And this is looking at the scientific data from a neutrino scattering experiment at Fermi National Accelerator Lab. And so the detector for the MINERVA experiment is shown on the right side of the slide there. There's a little cartoon person for scale with the detector. So it's this massive system. It used to sit up in just outside Chicago where Fermi Lab is. This detector was actually about, I think it was about 100 feet underground. I got to go visit it. It was pretty cool. And what happens with this detector is that the detector itself is exposed to a neutrino beam, which comes into the front part through those green plates and then proceeds through the detector. And what the scientists were interested in looking at Fermilab is where interactions of that neutrino beam occurred in the detector, kind of along the horizontal view. So they were looking for interactions between the neutrinos and the nuclei and the materials in this detector and figure out where interactions originated within the detector. So this was the classification task. It was divided up into 11 different regions. The task was to classify which region the original interaction occurred. So we worked with a scientist named Gabe Perdue at Fermilab, who sent us some of their data from this experiment. And our group at Oak Ridge took both a deep learning approach to looking at this data, as well as a spiking neural network and neuromorphic approach to looking at this data. And so the deep learning view was to take the data and interpret the energy values coming off the detector as pixels to represent an image that would then be fed into a convolutional neural network. The spiking approach, here we're showing the data as images, but really we're representing it as times that go into a spiking neural network. And it's the time when the energy deposition goes over a very low threshold. So you get very similar looking pictures of what the events look like, but the data is represented in two very different ways as it's fed into the different networks. So you can see the images that were fed into the convolutional neural networks. On the next slide, it's that same network we saw earlier, but what you're going to see here is the actual input data. So on the left side of the slide there, that's the full data that's going to be put in. The colors indicate the time at which it's going to arrive into the network. And then the middle panel is actually going to show you when the events are occurring and how they're fed into the network. So when you see the little flashes on the middle panel, those correspond to the events that are represented on the left side. And those are going to create spikes on the input neurons on the right side where the spiking neural network is. So these are the actual events recorded by the detector that we would then feed directly into the spiking neural network. And then what we would look at is the outputs, the red neurons on the network diagram, monitor those, look at how many spikes are coming off of each of the different potential classes, and then whichever one spiked the most would be our classification label. So given this sort of data, we could then kind of compare the performance of the spiking neural network to the deep learning approach. And really our end goal was to combine these two approaches because we expected that there was information that the deep learning approach could leverage and that there was information that the spiking neural network could leverage that could be combined together. That's actually work that's still in progress. But this was the result, kind of comparing the two to each other. And what we found is that the accuracies for the two approaches were actually pretty comparable. The difference in the accuracies was basically negligible. But what was really interesting is that EONS came up with a network that was 90 neurons and 86 synapses. So it wasn't even fully connected. Some of the input neurons weren't required to be connected to anything else. And we actually did this on our Mr. Dana system so we could have an estimated energy usage. So what was really interesting to me is that this spiking neural network, this 90 neuron, 86 synapse network, as compared with the convolutional neural network, which is shown across the top of the slide. And you can see at towards the end of the convolutional neural network, there are a couple of fully connected layers. That fully connected layer, the second one, has 98 neurons in it. So just that layer is bigger than the entire spiking neural network to solve this problem. So it's really interesting to me that we have the potential to leverage the temporal components, the complexity and the structure in the spiking neural network to maybe come up with smaller, more efficient solutions to similar tasks. And again, one of our goals here was then to take these two results together, combine them together in sort of an ensemble, and see if we can get even better results. And as I said, we're still looking at that now. Okay, and so now coming back to another example, I'm really excited about temporal processing like we did on that the Fermilab data, but I'm also really excited about control for neuromorphic systems. So this was another student project at the University of Tennessee where it was actually a senior design project where the students wanted to build a robot that was entirely controlled using a neuromorphic system. And so the task for this robot, the robot's name is Neon, is to navigate and explore an unfamiliar environment while avoiding obstacles. So basically, we want to be able to drop this robot into a room, have it cover as much ground as possible in the room, and not run into things along the way. Basically, we want it to be a smart Roomba. So the challenges that we imposed on this is that we were going to give it no explicit instructions on how to operate. The neuromorphic system controlling the robot is going to receive the sensor information directly as input, and it's going to produce motor controls directly as output. Right motor forward, right motor back, left motor forward, left motor back. So we're not even telling the spiking neural network, the neuromorphic system, how to turn left and right. It has to learn how to do that over the course of training. We're going to give it no prior knowledge about the environments we're going to put it into. The fitness evaluation process, we initialize random environments for it to train in, but then it can be dropped and testing into a new environment that it's never seen before. It has relatively limited input resolution. It has one LiDAR sensor that sits on a servo there on the front, and that servo sweeps it back and forth. It takes 5 readings, so we simulate having 5 LiDAR sensors. The reason we only use 1 LiDAR sensor is because this was a student project and they had a budget. The goal was to process all of the inputs and make all control decisions on the neuromorphic system on board the robot. In this case, we used the Dana 2 system implemented on an FPGA. And then perhaps the hardest part of this problem is that we were going to train only in simulation. So the environment was going to be simulated, the robot in the environment was going to be simulated, and the neuromorphic system was going to be simulated. And the expectation was we would be able to train in this simulated environment with the simulated robot and be able to transfer that into the physical robot in the real world and have it be able to operate seamlessly. And so, of course, because we wanted to be able to train in simulation, we were going to use a really high fidelity simulated environment. It looked like this. So as you can see, it's actually not a very detailed simulated environment. This was a simulation environment that our student Grant Brewer created. You might be able to tell by looking at this that Grant was a double major in computer science and physics, because to physicists, everything is a sphere. So the robot is a sphere, the obstacles are spheres. And you can see then the robots in the simulated environment with the simulated robot and the simulated neuromorphic system, navigating throughout the environment, covering as much ground as possible and not running into obstacles along the way. Obviously here the robot doesn't know, the sensor information does not tell it where it has actually been before. It can't tell where the coverage is. It has to be able to retain that as part of the training process. So this is what the simulation looked like. And then we deployed it onto the physical robot. This first clip was the very first time that we took the simulated, the trained network in simulation and deployed it onto the physical robot. That's why all of the students are in the background and why the obstacles were just whatever was in the professor's offices. We asked the professor who had the Law and Order video game in his office, why would you have a Law and Order video game in your office? And apparently he's hard to shop for. So that's one of the obstacles in this environment. And you can see, again, this first clip is the robot navigating throughout the environment and avoiding the new obstacles in the environment along the way. The second clip is later in a different room in our lab space, where again, they pulled whatever was in the lab out to set up as obstacles in the environment. The Neon robot continues to navigate around the environment, avoiding various types of obstacles successfully. One of the funny things about this clip at the very end of this video, the students actually set up traffic cones to block off a portion of the room that the robot did not need to get near, but they unfortunately left enough of a gap between the traffic cones that if that was space it needed to cover, it needed to get onto that area of the room. And so it ended up in that space, and it cuts very abruptly because the students stopped and ran over to rescue it from that area. So we're very excited about this one because it gives you a lot of the different components that make neuromorphic systems interesting. This was a entirely learned solution. It learned how to do everything from scratch. Trained only in simulation, was able to generalize in the real world. Deployed onto the physical system, in fact, the power usage of the FPGA when compared to the motor controls of the robot was practically negligible. So it could be very efficiently deployed onto physical hardware. So there's a lot of different factors here that makes kind of robotics and autonomous vehicles a natural application area for neuromorphic systems. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'll quickly summarize. So the future of AI is likely to include custom hardware like neural hardware and neuromorphic computing. So now is a really good time to get involved in doing research in these sorts of systems, especially for AI and machine learning people. I think there's a lot of really interesting research here because these systems are non-trivial to program, and there's a lot of opportunity to come up with new algorithms and new approaches and to have a big impact in the field. So we've developed a spiking neural network training methodology based on this evolutionary optimization approach. We've applied it to many different neuromorphic implementations, many different applications, some of which you've seen over the course of this presentation. And we're always looking, if you happen to be somebody who's developing neuromorphic hardware and you're interested in using EONS to design applications for your hardware, we're always looking for collaborators. If you have applications and you'd like to use neuromorphic systems, we're also always looking for applications collaborators. And if you have different learning rules that you think might benefit from utilizing EONS as a meta-learning tool, we're also very happy to collaborate on those sorts of projects as well. So now is definitely the time to get involved in this field. It's been a very exciting field to be a part of, a great community to be able to contribute and make an impact. So if you're interested in learning more about neuromorphic, I would encourage you to check out the survey paper. I worked really hard on it. I joke that if you're a graduate student and you're doing a literature review, you're welcome. I took care of everything before 2017 for you. Hopefully this will help. But if you're just interested in learning about the field, I would encourage you to check it out. I try to give kind of a broad view of everything going on in neuromorphic, from the architectures and hardware to the algorithms to the applications and so on. And these are my co-authors on that paper. If you are interested in engaging with the neuromorphic computing community, I co-organize a conference called ICONS, the International Conference on Neuromorphic Systems. We were planning to have that conference in Chicago in July. We are still hoping to have some version of an in-person meeting, but we will also be having the conference virtually during that time. So if you're interested in joining either in person, if that's possible, or virtually, we'd encourage you to visit our website, icons.ornl.gov. The call for submissions is still open. The deadline is May 1st. If you would like an extension, I'm the program committee chair. Just reach out to me, send me an email. We can try to work something out. But we're accepting both abstract submissions for posters and presentations, as well as short and full paper submissions, along with tutorials and special session submissions. So if you're interested in leading a tutorial or a special session, please reach out, and I'm happy to talk more about that. And so with that, I'll thank my collaborators at Oak Ridge, as well as the TINLab Neuromorphic Research Group at the University of Tennessee, as well as our sponsors. And if you're interested in learning more about the work that the TINLab group does, our website is neuromorphic.ecs.utk.edu. And finally, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. If you would rather reach out to me personally, you can email me, or you can also reach me on Twitter. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the talk, Katie. We'll open it up for questions right now. You can either ask the question. I think we have one.
Yes, I'm happy to share a copy of the presentation. So for the asteroid game and the LiDAR ring, it does not have to, you can actually change the number of LiDAR sensors. That's a parameter in our simulation. And so it doesn't have to match the dimensionality of the space being learned. It's parameterizable for the application. So we happen to use 30 in that case, but you can change it. You can add more. You can do less. So you can try different things with the way the application works.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I didn't. The question was actually not the number of LiDARs, but the number of elements in the ring. Do those have to be two-dimensional if the space is two-dimensional?
Oh, yeah, okay. So yeah, so there were two rings of 30 sensors each. Right. In that case, those two corresponded to, one was closer and one was further away. You could add more to give the network more information about how close or far the asteroids are in the environment, or you can use a different encoding approach to have more spikes if the asteroid is closer, or something like that.
Okay, cool. Okay, thanks.
Okay, while we're waiting for the next question, Katie, so in your robotics or controls implementation, what spiking algorithm did you implement in there?
The encoding algorithm?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so for the Asteroids game, as I mentioned, there are those two rings, and we just fire once per sampling time step. Depending on if there is something in that field of view, and then if it's close, you fire the neuron that corresponds to close by. If it's further away, you fire the one that's further. For the robot, the LiDAR sensors, it was the same thing. We were sampling at a particular rate, and then it would spike if there was something in that field of view, and it would not spike if it wasn't. But actually, one of the, it's funny because it's my next, my like backup slides. We have a paper where we did some work on looking at different input encoding schemes for how to translate different types of data into spikes into these spiking neural networks, because it's often non-trivial to figure out how to take data and map that into the network. And so if you're interested in that work, I'm happy to talk more about that offline. Anybody has any questions about that?
Sounds good.
Have we tried with 2 players? We have not. That is something that I am interested in, having this sort of adversarial learning and competitive learning, so that the networks actually play against each other in different games. It's not something we've done yet, but it's something we're interested in pursuing.
Okay, I'll pitch in again. So of all the challenges, you mentioned that, I think there's one more question. Maybe I'll answer that.
Frequently the networks that are evolved are highly recurrent. You saw, I think in the Asteroids example, where you see the full network, we frequently have input to input, output to input connections. There's typically many different recurrent connections in these networks, and that's because we don't restrict any connectivity in the evolution. So it's whatever is going to work for the problem. They tend to evolve relatively small networks anyway, but we've also added sort of additional objectives into the evolution to force fewer neurons to have more efficient systems. And so it will train systems that have very few neurons and leverage these recurrent connections to be able to get the compute that it needs.
I have a question.
Sure.
What's the limit on the data input for your systems at present? Because we're exploring some research in terms of the 3- and 4-dimensional, including time of evolution in space physics. And what sort of data input limits do you see in your research right now? And when you expand it from 2D, like say the robot that was exploring, trying to make the right turn, left turn, avoid all the obstacles, when you expand it to 3D and 4D, time independent and time dependent, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or I'm sorry, the Schrodinger equation with the Hamiltonian energy function?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is an ongoing issue trying to figure out how to encode the data appropriately into the spiking neural networks. And so certainly if your data has a native temporal component to it, it makes sense to encode that in time in the network if that makes sense computationally at the time scale that you're operating on. But in terms of dimensionality, you can have more flexibility in how you represent the neurons in the physical neuromorphic architecture to represent whatever dimension you're trying to do. So we haven't explicitly explored how we would represent different dimensions beyond. We do have like a 3D version of the navigation that we were targeting drones, but we don't change the way that we encode the information much, other than we kind of lay out the neurons in a particular way in the hardware. So it would be, I guess it would be application dependent of what would make sense, but we haven't done any particular research on the dimensionality.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so from Sean, I hope that there is the opportunity to utilize neuromorphic for easier and cheaper to manufacture. So actually, one of the research projects that a colleague at Oak Ridge, now I have a prop. Hopefully you can see me on the video. So we're exploring very cheap implementations of fully digital systems on FPGAs, so that it would be a quick and easy something for students to explore. So we have a board that we're developing. This is led by Parker Mitchell at Oak Ridge National Lab. The system is called MicroCaspian. And this implements a neuromorphic system on an FPGA on the board. It includes power monitoring as well, so you can do real-time power monitoring. It operates at about a milliwatt, and it can hold networks of up to 256 neurons and 4,000 synapses. So all of the applications that I went over today can be implemented on this board here. And this is something that we are working on actively right now. This is one of 2 boards that we have made so far, and we're hoping to make this available to the broader community as a research tool. And so this, the FPGA that is on this board is a $5 FPGA. So you can get some of the benefits of the neuromorphic systems, not necessarily all the full efficiency benefits that you would get from a custom chip, but some of the benefits by moving to this sort of system. And so we're hoping to make these available, certainly to the research community, to be able to more rapidly do neuromorphic development and deployment.
So I think in the last 2 minutes that we have, Katie, if you've summarized a lot of challenges and you recognize being in this field over the last few years, there are several small and big challenges with spiking neural networks. And one of the challenge with this community has always been, or from the machine learning point of view, is like the demonstration on large scale applications. How well do they perform? So there are some early ones, like Lohi's trying to showcase some. There are a few others, definitely. But what do you see as if you have to kind of identify 3 challenges that the community is currently facing to kind of scale it up and demonstrate on real world applications and have like state-of-the-art performance when you're comparing with the ML counterparts in some cases?
Right. So there's, I would say there's a couple of different, I can think of 2 immediately. So the first is that the algorithms that we have are still evolving. Like, I don't think we have a good approach for doing kind of large scale applications with the existing algorithms that we have. And I think the ones that target very large scale network implementations tend to be the more backpropagation based approaches, which I don't think are going to be satisfactory in actually demonstrating an advantage over existing approaches. So that's one issue, obviously iterating on the algorithms. The second key thing, and this is something that actually I think, Drisha, we've talked about before, and it's certainly an ongoing discussion with many of my colleagues in neuromorphic, is that I don't think that there's a good benchmark application set for neuromorphic systems yet. I think it doesn't make sense for us to target applications like ImageNet or image classification, the kind of canonical curated applications, data sets that are in the world right now. I think we really need to, as a community, come up with our own sets of data, our own applications, our own challenge problems that we want to tackle, where neuromorphic could really have an impact, and to kind of get at some of those application characteristics that we identified at that workshop in 2016 in the sort of benchmark applications that we would develop for neuromorphic. And so that's something that I've been talking about in particular with some colleagues at Sandia, and we're actually organizing a special session on benchmarking applications for neuromorphic at ICONS this year, so that we can talk more about this, because we really need to, as a community, kind of come up with the data sets, come up with the applications that we're going to try to target where we would actually see neuromorphic being very successful. And then the availability of the hardware would be the third challenge, because it's really nice to have Loihi. It's nice to be part of the Intel research community. They have relatively limited hardware resources right now, actually. So, running on the cloud can only get you so far, and actually being able to quickly evaluate new solutions. So really having access to hands-on hardware to be able to quickly accelerate the development of these algorithms and applications is another big challenge. Like, we're not going to be able to make progress if we don't have the appropriate hardware to actually do the accelerated computation. So I like to say that neuromorphic processors, to me, are going to do for spiking neural network research what GPUs did for deep learning, but we're going to require the actual hardware to be able to do that.
Great. Yep.
I had a last question. Is that okay? I wanted to know, in your experience with the neuromorphic hardware, because in the simulated space, and when we're trying algorithms or something, we can really experiment with evolutionary algorithms, stacking them on to neuromorphic algorithms as well. But from a hardware perspective, is there any hardware which inherently supports a neuroevolutionary algorithm or that kind of mechanism? Growing and expanding.
So I haven't seen any that implement the evolution directly on the chip, but it's very easy to do this, to do like EONS or other evolutionary approaches with hardware in the loop. And the EONS algorithm itself is very lightweight, and so it can run on a very small CPU to be able to actually operate with the chip in the loop. So what we have done is we've run EONS coupled with physical hardware, simulating and performing the fitness evaluation on the hardware, sometimes in a massively parallel way, so running multiple networks simultaneously on the hardware, and then using that to get the results off more quickly. Now, I will say that the key thing with using algorithms like EONS with hardware, the key feature for making that fast and easy to use is enabling rapid reprogrammability of the hardware. So being able to try different parameters, try different network structures very quickly. Not all hardware is built to do that. Not all communication structures on neuromorphic systems are built to do that. But I think that's going to be important moving forward, especially if we want to think about using neuromorphic systems as coprocessors in future systems. It's not just about the training, it's also about the actual deployment. So I think that's something that needs to be considered as part of the actual design process as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katie Schuman, for doing this presentation today. It's been a pleasure. I think consider this as a loud claps from all of us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, well, I have a meeting, another phone call, so I'm going to sign off now. But if anybody has any further questions, I'm happy to follow up via email.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.